I knew something inside my life had cracked the moment the heirloom tools were dismissed as worthless and dropped onto my dining table, as if decades of work, sacrifice, and family history meant nothing. The room fell silent, but what hurt most was not the splintered wood. It was the silence beside me, the realization that respect can vanish in a single careless instant. That night forced me to choose between keeping peace and keeping my dignity, and the choice would change everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and love. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so don't hold back. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey that might just change the way you see things. Let's dive in. My name is Margaret Whitaker, though most people in Asheville have called me Maggie for as long as I can remember. I am 68 years old, and the scent of cut cedar and walnut has followed me through every season of my life. If you stand on the slope behind my house in the early morning, you can see the Blue Ridge Mountains rolling into mist, layered like folded quilts, stitched by careful hands. That view has greeted 4 generations of my family, and just below it sits the workshop that shaped us all. The Whitaker workshop is not impressive by modern standards. Its timber siding is weathered silver, and the wide plank doors still slide along iron tracks my grandfather installed before I was born. Inside, sunlight falls through high windows onto benches scarred by decades of work. Each mark tells a story of a chair leg shaped, a tabletop leveled, a mistake corrected rather than discarded. My grandfather began the business with hand tools and a belief that anything built with patience would outlast fashion. My parents carried it through the post-war years when families wanted solid dining tables and dressers that would follow them from house to house. When my husband died suddenly 33 years ago, the orders slowed, the debts mounted, and grief settled over the shop like sawdust no broom could clear. I learned to lift lumber that strained my shoulders and to negotiate with suppliers who assumed I would fail. There were mornings I unlocked the doors before sunrise, unsure how payroll would be met, and nights I sat alone at the office desk calculating which bill could wait. I did not rebuild the business out of ambition. I rebuilt it because it was the only way forward. My son Daniel grew up in that space between struggle and purpose. As a boy, he pushed a broom across the floor, the pile of sawdust rising nearly to his knees. He learned to sort hardware into labeled drawers and to sand table legs smooth enough that no splinter could catch a fingertip. We ate lunches together on overturned crates, sharing sandwiches wrapped in wax paper while the radio hummed old country songs in the background. Those quiet hours taught us a language that did not need many words. Winter mornings meant hot cocoa warming our hands while we reviewed the ledger at the small desk near the finishing room. In summer, we opened both workshop doors to let mountain air carry away the smell of varnish. Daniel watched more than he spoke, studying how customers ran their palms across a tabletop before deciding it belonged in their home. He left for college to study marketing and communications, convinced small businesses could survive through modern storytelling and branding. I did not argue. Roots, if they are strong, do not snap when stretched. He moved to the city, chasing opportunity, and promised he would return someday. The house above the workshop holds our history as surely as the shop holds our labor. Oak floors have been worn smooth by footsteps long gone. Quilts stitched by my grandmother rest across the backs of chairs my grandfather built. A long dining table anchors the room, its surface bearing faint impressions from holiday meals and late-night accounting sessions. Nothing here was chosen for trend or status. Each object remains because it endured. I have never claimed to build an empire. I preserve something honest, I believed that was enough, and that time, steady and patient, would guide my son back to the life waiting for him. For many years, that belief felt as solid as the mountains surrounding us. Looking back now, I can see how easily permanence can disguise the first quiet shift beneath one's feet. If you are still watching and feel that something is not quite right beneath the surface, comment one below so I know you are with me. Now, let's move on to what first made me question everything. The afternoon Daniel brought Vanessa Cole to the house, the light had begun to soften into that pale gold that comes with early autumn in the mountains. The air carried the faint scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke, a reminder that summer's warmth was giving way to something quieter and more reflective. I heard the unfamiliar car before I saw it, tires crunching over the gravel drive in a rhythm that did not belong to our usual visitors. When I stepped onto the porch, Daniel was already out of the driver's seat, smoothing the front of his shirt in a gesture I recognized from his teenage years whenever he felt uncertain. Vanessa stepped out a moment later. She moved with a kind of deliberate grace, her posture straight, her gestures measured. Her clothes were simple but unmistakably expensive, soft, neutral tones that seemed designed to photograph well in any light. When she smiled, it was warm but controlled, as if she understood precisely how long to hold the expression. Her voice, when she introduced herself, carried a smooth cadence that suggested years spent speaking into microphones rather than across kitchen tables. She paused at the edge of the porch and took in the view of the Blue Ridge Mountains, stretching into the distance. She called it breathtaking and said the setting felt serene. I thanked her and led them inside, watching as her eyes moved quickly across the room, noting the exposed beams, the handmade furniture, the quilts folded over chair backs. She complimented the architecture and the natural light, then suggested that softer bulbs and fewer objects on the mantel might make the space feel more contemporary. Her tone remained pleasant, yet I felt as though the warmth of the room had been translated into design language. Daniel introduced her work over coffee, explaining that she hosted a lifestyle podcast and advised brands on image and audience alignment. Vanessa spoke about curated living, intentional aesthetics, and the importance of visual coherence. The words floated above the table like unfamiliar birds. I understood each one individually, yet together they described a world far removed from the tangible rhythm of saws, planes, and sanding blocks. When we walked down to the workshop, she ran her fingers along the edge of a walnut dining table, waiting for delivery. She asked how long it took to produce and whether scaling production might improve margins. I answered her questions, though I noticed she never asked who built it or how the grain had been matched across the surface. Daniel watched her with quiet pride, as if her curiosity confirmed the importance of what he had brought into his life. That evening, after they had gone for a drive into town, I found myself scrolling through Vanessa's social media pages. The photographs were beautifully composed: rooftop dinners, luxury hotel rooms, polished interiors washed in natural light. Everything appeared deliberate, harmonious, and strangely impersonal. The comments praised aspiration more than connection. At dinner, she spoke about building lifestyle narratives and aligning identity with presentation. Daniel listened with an attentiveness that was both tender and new. His happiness complicated the unease forming beneath my ribs. After they retired for the night, I stood at the kitchen window and watched fog gather in the valley below. Nothing had been said to wound me, nothing done to offend. Yet the rhythm of the house felt slightly altered, like a familiar song played in a different key. I told myself change was natural, even necessary. Still, as the mountains faded into darkness, I sensed a quiet rearrangement had begun, one that I could feel but not yet name. If you can sense the tension beginning to build and want to see where these warning signs lead, comment 2 below to stay with the story. Now, let's continue to the moment things started to shift. By the time the first hard frost silvered the grass along the workshop yard, Vanessa's presence in my home had settled into something that felt less like a visit and more like a quiet reorganization. Daniel explained that the housing market in Asheville had tightened and that staying with me would only be temporary. I told him there was no need to rush. A mother learns to make space for her child, even when that space begins to change shape. At first, the adjustments were small enough to seem practical. One afternoon, I returned from the workshop to find the heavy floral curtains in the living room replaced with pale linen panels that allowed more light to enter. Vanessa said the room felt brighter and more open. The change was pleasant, and I thanked her. A few days later, the mantel displayed fewer objects. The small porcelain bird my mother had kept for decades was moved to a shelf in the hallway. In its place stood a single ceramic vase, unglazed and sculptural. Vanessa spoke often about balance and visual clarity. She introduced neutral throws in place of the quilts folded over chair backs and arranged candles with subtle fragrances that replaced the faint scent of pine and wood oil I had grown accustomed to. None of it was offensive, yet with each adjustment the room felt less like a place where people lived and more like a space prepared to be observed. Daniel began using the same language she did. He said the house felt refreshed, lighter, more current. I listened, recognizing his enthusiasm, while sensing that something less visible was being folded away with the quilts. Over the following weeks, changes expanded beyond textiles and lighting. My grandmother's rocking chair was moved from its place near the window and replaced with a low, modern seat Vanessa said would photograph better. Family photographs that had lined the living room wall for years appeared one evening in the hallway instead. Their relocation was subtle enough that a visitor might not notice, but I felt the absence immediately, like a voice removed from a familiar song. I began to notice Vanessa moving through rooms with her phone raised, adjusting angles, stepping back to capture lines of light across the floorboards. She explained she was documenting interior inspiration for her audience. I thought little of it until a longtime client mentioned seeing my workshop online. He said it looked beautiful, like the studio of a designer. That evening I found the post. Sunlight streamed through the workshop windows, illuminating the workbench where my father once planed oak boards. The caption described the space as a creative sanctuary tied to Vanessa's lifestyle brand. Ownership was never claimed outright, yet the implication hovered between the words. Daniel seemed pleased by the attention. He spoke about exposure and modern branding opportunities, about how storytelling could expand reach beyond the region. I heard his excitement and remembered the boy who once counted screws beside me. Still, I sensed a widening distance in how we define value. At the workshop, the artisans greeted Vanessa politely when she visited, but the rhythm of sanding and shaping resumed with a visible ease after she left. One of the older craftsmen remarked quietly that a shop feels different when it is photographed instead of worked in. That evening I stood in the living room as dusk gathered beyond the windows. The space looked orderly, calm, and unfamiliar. Nothing had been taken, nothing broken. Yet the textures that carried our history had been softened or moved aside. I understood then that erosion does not arrive with noise. It advances through small permissions granted one at a time. If you have ever ignored a red flag and are wondering how far this will go, comment 3 below and keep watching. Now let's move into the decision that changed the course of everything. By late November, the workshop moved with the steady urgency that always arrives before winter holidays. Orders filled the schedule weeks ahead, and the scent of fresh varnish hung in the air long after dusk. I found comfort in routine, unlocking the doors before sunrise, checking inventory sheets, and listening to the familiar cadence of planers smoothing hardwood into silence. Work had always steadied me. Wood did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Vanessa's involvement had shifted from rearranging rooms to studying the business itself. She began sitting with Daniel at the kitchen table in the evenings, reviewing numbers and discussing growth strategies. I overheard phrases that sounded clinical and abstract: cost efficiencies, margin optimization, market positioning. Their conversations were not hostile, yet they felt detached from the human effort that shaped every piece leaving our shop. One evening, she spoke about repositioning the Whitaker name for the luxury lifestyle market. She described outsourcing portions of production to reduce labor costs and importing materials to increase scalability. She suggested transitioning from a workshop identity to a design studio brand that could extend into curated home goods and digital lifestyle content. Daniel listened with an interest that was both intellectual and hopeful. He said evolution was necessary to remain relevant. I asked whether she would spend time on the workshop floor to understand the craft behind each piece. She replied gently that strategic direction did not require hands-on experience. Her tone remained respectful, yet the words revealed a divide I could no longer ignore. To her, value could be conceptual. To me, value was shaped through labor and patience. A week later, while reviewing invoices in the office, I noticed printed renderings tucked beneath a ledger. They showed revised logo concepts and website mock-ups emphasizing minimalist typography and polished interiors. There was no mention of heritage, no photographs of craftsmen at work, no trace of the story that had carried our reputation for decades. The imagery was elegant and interchangeable, as though any name might be substituted without consequence. That afternoon, Mr. Alvarez, who had worked beside my father and later beside me, knocked softly on the office door. He spoke with the careful restraint of a man who understands loyalty runs both ways. He told me Vanessa had met with a regional developer visiting town. The developer had been acquiring mountain properties for a luxury retreat community. Preliminary sketches, he said, included parcels near our workshop. I felt no immediate shock. Instead, a stillness settled over me, the kind that arrives when something long feared finally takes shape. When I asked Daniel about the meeting that evening, he described it as exploratory, a conversation about partnership opportunities and future growth. He spoke about unlocking potential and protecting long-term viability. I heard sincerity in his voice, yet the language felt borrowed. That night, after the house had quieted, I pulled out documents I had not reviewed in years: property deeds, zoning maps, estate papers bearing signatures from another lifetime. I realized the land beneath the workshop, the slope my grandfather cleared by hand, could be vulnerable if passed forward without protection. Over dinner in the days that followed, Vanessa continued discussing brand alignment and leveraging location appeal. The phrases were smooth and persuasive, yet beneath them I heard the language of liquidation disguised as progress. After closing one evening, I remained alone in the workshop. The lights cast long shadows across the benches, and the scent of walnut shavings lingered in the cooling air. I ran my palm across a finished tabletop, feeling the grain rise beneath my skin. Preserving this place might require decisions that would wound the very relationship I had spent a lifetime protecting. Love can survive disagreement, I thought, but it rarely survives the surrender of one's core values. If you feel the pressure building and think a breaking point is coming, comment 4 below so I know you are still here. Now let's step into the moment that shattered the silence. Thanksgiving arrived wrapped in the familiar rituals that had steadied my life for decades. By early afternoon, the house carried the layered scents of roasting turkey, sage stuffing, cinnamon, and the faint wood smoke drifting from the stone fireplace. Outside, the mountain stood bare and quiet beneath a pale sky, while inside the dining room glowed with lamplight, reflecting off the long walnut table my grandfather had built with his own hands. That table had witnessed births, funerals, reconciliations, and ordinary Sundays. It held our history without complaint. Guests filled the room with the easy warmth that comes from years of shared trust. Two of our longest-standing clients sat near the hearth with their spouses, speaking softly about grandchildren and travel plans. Mr. Alvarez and his wife arrived carrying a pecan pie wrapped in foil, the scent of toasted sugar trailing behind them. Laughter moved gently through the room, never loud, never forced. For a few hours, continuity felt intact. Daniel sat to my right, relaxed in a way I had not seen in months. Vanessa, seated beside him, moved gracefully through conversation, attentive and composed. She listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and offered compliments that seemed tailored to each guest. Watching her, I understood how easily she could be admired. She possessed a fluency in social spaces that made people feel seen, even if only briefly. Dinner unfolded without tension. Plates passed, glasses refilled, and stories overlapped in the comfortable way they do when people know one another well. I allowed myself to believe that perhaps shared tradition could bridge the quiet distance that had grown between my son and me. After dessert, I rose and retrieved the velvet-wrapped bundle I had placed in the sideboard earlier that morning. The room settled into a softer hush as I set it before Daniel. I told him the carving tools inside had belonged to his grandfather and had shaped the first Whitaker tables more than 70 years ago. I explained how the handles had been worn smooth by decades of hands and how each blade had been sharpened and maintained with care rather than replaced. He opened the bundle slowly. The lamplight caught the polished steel and the darkened patina of aged wood. His expression softened as he lifted one tool, turning it carefully between his fingers. I saw recognition in his eyes, not just of the object, but of the life that had shaped it. Vanessa leaned forward and asked to see them. Her voice carried curiosity, nothing sharper. She held one of the tools beneath the light, examining its worn handle and darkened grain. After a moment, she remarked that it looked outdated, like something one might find at a flea market, and wondered aloud whether modern tools would be more practical. Her tone remained even, almost analytical. When she placed the tool back on the table, her hand released it too abruptly. The aged wooden handle struck the surface at an angle, and a thin splinter lifted where time had weakened the grain. The sound was small, but it seemed to echo through the room. Conversation stopped. A fork rested motionless against porcelain. Mr. Alvarez lowered his gaze. The fire shifted in the hearth with a quiet, settling sigh. I waited for Daniel to speak, to bridge the distance that had opened between reverence and dismissal. Seconds stretched, weighty and slow. He remained still, caught between two worlds. I bent and lifted the damaged tool. The splintered edge pressed lightly into my palm, a fragile fracture where strength had endured for decades. I returned to my seat without raising my voice. Anger would have been easier to understand, but what I felt was a deeper recognition. Something essential had been struck, not by malice, but by a failure to recognize what cannot be replaced. As the room slowly resumed its murmur, I held the tool in my lap and understood that the break before me was both small and irreversible. Wood can be repaired, I thought, but the seam remains, a quiet line carrying the memory of the moment it gave way. The murmur of conversation returned to the dining room, but it moved cautiously, as though each voice were testing the air before speaking. I remained seated for a moment, the damaged carving tool resting across my palms. The splintered edge pressed lightly against my skin, not painful, only present. Around me, plates were shifted, glasses lifted, and chairs adjusted with quiet restraint. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds lay a stillness I had never felt in this house before. I looked at the faces around the table. Mr. Alvarez kept his eyes lowered, his hands folded together as if in silent respect. One of our longtime clients studied the grain of the table rather than meet my gaze. Vanessa sat upright, composed, her expression thoughtful but untroubled, as though the moment had registered only as an awkward pause in an otherwise successful evening. Daniel stared at the tabletop, his shoulders drawn inward, the conflict within him visible in the tension of his jaw. In that stillness, I understood that the fracture before us was not confined to wood. It lay in the space between reverence and dismissal, between inheritance and convenience. Endurance had carried me through many storms, but preservation required something different. It required clarity. I rose from my chair and excused myself. My voice sounded calm, even to my own ears. In the study, I opened the desk drawer where the folder had rested for weeks, waiting for a moment I had hoped would never arrive. The papers inside were orderly and precise: financial authorizations, governance documents, and the legal filings completed after I learned of developer interest in the mountain properties surrounding the workshop. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation faded again. I did not raise my voice. I placed the folder on the table and addressed Daniel, though I was aware the entire room listened. I explained that effective immediately, his authority over the workshop's financial accounts would be suspended and all strategic decisions would revert to my sole stewardship. No restructuring proposals, partnerships, or brand repositioning efforts would proceed. My tone remained measured, not punitive. Stewardship, I said, requires alignment with the values that built what we are entrusted to protect. Vanessa began to respond, speaking of growth potential and modernization, but I lifted my hand gently. Expansion without integrity dismantles what cannot be rebuilt, I told her, and legacy is not a product line to be repositioned. I then explained that the property deeds and surrounding acreage had been transferred into a heritage preservation trust earlier that autumn. The land could not be sold, redeveloped, or leveraged for resort construction. The decision ensured the workshop and mountain slope would remain protected beyond my lifetime. Daniel looked up then, shock replacing the confusion in his expression. He understood the permanence of what I had done and the foresight it required. Vanessa's composure faltered for the first time, the careful stillness in her posture giving way to disbelief. I told my son he was welcome in my home and welcome in the workshop. He could continue to work, to learn, and to earn stewardship through commitment. Inheritance was not revoked, but it could not be treated as a commodity. Legacy, I said quietly, is carried, not consumed. No one spoke. The fire shifted in the hearth, sending a soft cascade of embers into the grate. I set the damaged carving tool gently on the table between us, the fracture visible but contained. I felt grief move through me alongside resolve. Drawing a boundary costs something, even when it protects what must endure. As I resumed my seat, I understood that the course of my life had altered. The past was safeguarded, but the future would now unfold along a different path. When a line is drawn with clarity rather than anger, its permanence cannot be mistaken. If you believe dignity has a price and want to see what happens after that line is drawn, comment 6 below and join me in Chapter 7. The morning after Thanksgiving arrived without ceremony. A thin frost glazed the grass beyond the kitchen window, and the mountains wore a pale, colorless light that comes only after a hard night of cold. I rose before dawn out of habit, moving through the house with the quiet care one uses in unfamiliar surroundings, though nothing had physically changed. The coffee pot hissed softly, and the scent filled the kitchen, but the familiar comfort it once carried seemed muted, as if sound itself had chosen to tread lightly. The dining room bore only the faint evidence of the evening before. The long walnut table stood cleared and polished, its surface reflecting the soft light from the overhead fixture. Chairs were returned to their places, and the last of the dishes rested in orderly stacks beside the sink. Yet the room held a lingering weight, like air after a storm that has passed but not yet fully released its charge. Daniel came downstairs later than usual. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were measuring each step. He nodded when he saw me, his eyes shadowed by a sleepless night. There was no anger in his expression, only the stunned quiet of a man whose understanding of his own life had shifted overnight. Vanessa did not appear. The floor above remained silent, except for the faint creak of a door closing sometime mid-morning. I carried the carving tools into the study and placed them carefully inside the desk drawer. The splintered handle would be repaired in time, but I found myself pausing before closing the drawer, acknowledging that repair and restoration are not the same thing. Some marks remain as testimony rather than damage. By late morning, my phone began to vibrate with messages. Clients who had attended dinner expressed support in careful, respectful language. One wrote that integrity is the rarest form of wealth. Mr. Alvarez stopped by briefly, not to discuss work but to shake my hand with a quiet gravity that needed no words. The workshop, it seemed, had been steadied rather than shaken. Upstairs, Vanessa moved between rooms with the restless energy of someone trying to maintain control over a narrative slipping beyond reach. I heard her voice once through the floorboards, measured but strained, followed by the soft chime of incoming notifications. Her world existed in networks and impressions. Disruption traveled there faster than any rumor could move through town. Daniel left the house before sunrise the following morning. I arrived at the workshop to find him already inside, sleeves rolled, sweeping sawdust into neat piles along the floor. He did not approach me with explanations or requests. Instead, he asked where he should begin. I directed him toward a stack of unfinished chair backs awaiting sanding. He worked without speaking, his movements careful, attentive, unfamiliar but sincere. The artisans acknowledged him with quiet nods and returned to their tasks. Respect in a workshop is granted through participation, not apology. By midday, fine dust clung to his cuffs and settled into the lines of his hands. He did not brush it away. At home that evening, the silence remained, but it had softened. It no longer pressed against the walls. It settled instead like snow, absorbing sharp edges. I felt grief for the fracture within my son's marriage and relief that the workshop stood protected. Both emotions occupied the same space, neither canceling the other. At dusk, I paused in the workshop doorway and watched Daniel sweep the floor once more, drawing sawdust into a careful pile. The gesture mirrored a boy I had watched years before, determined to be useful in a world larger than himself. Truth, I realized, does not arrive with noise. It settles slowly, asking each of us what we will do once we finally see it. Winter settled over Asheville with a quiet finality, muting the mountains beneath a ceiling of low gray cloud. Each morning the cold sharpened the air, and our breath drifted in pale ribbons as we crossed the yard toward the workshop. The season imposed stillness on the landscape, yet inside the shop the rhythm of work continued, steady and necessary. I had long believed routine could carry a person through uncertainty, and in those weeks after Thanksgiving, routine became our anchor. The call from the regional boutique hotel arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. The manager spoke with professional courtesy, explaining that in light of recent rumors regarding instability within the Whitaker business, they would pause their furnishing contract until the situation clarified. He emphasized that the decision was precautionary rather than permanent. When I set the receiver down, I felt the familiar weight of risk settle across my shoulders. Reputation, once questioned, travels faster than any delivery truck. Daniel stood in the doorway of the office, having heard enough to understand. We did not waste time on speculation. Instead, we spread the order schedule across the desk and reviewed each piece awaiting completion. We agreed to finish the remaining furnishings ahead of deadline, photograph the completed work, and send documentation demonstrating continuity and quality. Reliability, I told him, is proven through action rather than reassurance. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's commitment deepened into something quieter and more deliberate. He arrived before dawn, often unlocking the doors before I reached the yard. He learned finishing techniques that required patience rather than strength, applying stain in slow, even passes and sanding between coats until the surface felt like satin beneath the palm. When corrected, he listened without defensiveness. When uncertain, he asked for guidance instead of pretending confidence. The craftsman responded with the nods and practical advice, the unspoken language of acceptance beginning to form. By midday, fine dust clung to his sleeves and settled into the creases of his hands. He did not brush it away. At home, the atmosphere remained subdued, but no longer brittle. Vanessa spent long hours revising podcast scripts that seemed increasingly strained, her voice drifting through the floorboards in repeated attempts to capture enthusiasm she no longer felt. Sponsorship inquiries slowed, messages accumulated without response. I heard the restlessness in her pacing and recognized the disorientation of a life built on impressions when impressions began to fracture. Eventually, she began searching for work beyond the world she had curated. Rejections arrived politely, citing limited operational experience. One afternoon, she returned with news of a retail position at a home goods store in a nearby shopping district. The job required standing for long hours, assisting customers, and managing inventory. It bore little resemblance to the life she had presented to the world. During her first week, she came home exhausted, her movement slower, the careful composure she once carried replaced by visible fatigue. One evening, she stood at the stove attempting to prepare pasta. The effort was hesitant but sincere. I tasted a forkful when she offered it and told her it was fine. The simplicity of the exchange carried more honesty than any of our previous conversations. Daniel remained reserved, yet the guarded tension between them softened into quiet distance rather than sharp conflict. At dawn one morning, Daniel and I loaded finished furniture into the delivery truck. Our movements aligned without instruction, boards lifted and secured in practiced rhythm. Nothing had been restored to what it once was, yet something steadier was taking shape. Repair, I understood, does not recreate the past. It builds a future informed by what was learned in the breaking. If you are wondering whether broken trust can ever lead to healing, comment 8 below and stay with me for the final outcome. By late February, the hard edge of winter began to soften. Patches of thawed earth appeared along the driveway, and thin threads of birdsong returned to the valley at dawn. The mountains still held their muted winter colors, but the light lingered longer each evening, as if the day itself were gathering the courage to begin again. Change, I had learned, rarely arrives with fanfare. It unfolds in small permissions granted by time. Daniel's movements in the workshop had grown steady and unassuming. He no longer carried himself like a visitor stepping into an inherited space. Instead, he moved with attentiveness, listening more than he spoke, watching the craftsman before offering suggestions. Customers began directing their questions to him, seeking his opinion on finishes and wood selection. He answered plainly, without the polished language he once favored, and I saw trust settle naturally around him. Humility had replaced certainty. Purpose had replaced ambition. At home, Vanessa's routine reflected a different kind of transformation. The retail position had stripped away the careful presentation she once maintained. She left early each morning in simple clothes and comfortable shoes, returning with tired shoulders and the faint scent of cardboard and packing tape clinging to her sleeves. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter, less measured, as though she no longer performed for an invisible audience. The distance between her and Daniel grew unmistakable. Their conversations revolved around schedules, bills, and practical matters. They moved through the house with careful politeness, navigating around one another like courteous strangers sharing a waiting room. There were no raised voices, no sharp exchanges. The absence of conflict felt more final than anger would have. One evening, they asked to speak privately. I remained in the kitchen rinsing dishes slowly, allowing the water to run longer than necessary. When they returned, their expressions held a calm I recognized as resolution rather than relief. They had decided to separate. There were no accusations. Daniel acknowledged he had ignored his own instincts, allowing admiration to guide choices that required deeper discernment. Vanessa spoke of building a life around perception and validation, mistaking admiration for identity. Neither could return to who they had been before. Their words were measured, not defensive, as though truth had replaced the need to persuade. I felt sorrow for the pain my son carried, relief that clarity had emerged, and a quiet compassion for the young woman confronting the collapse of a carefully constructed life. Vanessa planned to relocate to Nashville, where a coworker had offered to share an apartment. She spoke of rebuilding independently without the scaffolding of image. The decision reflected accountability rather than escape. The morning she left was restrained and quiet. Suitcases were carried to the car, the trunk closing with a soft, final sound. She paused at the bottom step, offering a brief nod that held more sincerity than any words she had spoken in my home. Then she drove away, her car disappearing along the curve of the mountain road. Daniel and I stood on the porch long after the sound of the engine faded. The silence between us felt reflective rather than empty. In the weeks that followed, he assumed greater responsibility at the workshop. Artisans consulted him. Clients requested him by name. He did not claim authority, he earned it. Loss, I realized, strips away illusion and reveals character with a clarity success rarely provides. As the sun set one evening, I watched Daniel carry lumber across the workshop floor, his silhouette framed in the doorway. The movement echoed generations before him, steady and purposeful, as if the past had not been erased but distilled into something honest that could endure. By late spring, the mountains had turned a deep, generous green. Dogwoods bloomed along the roadside, their white petals bright against the returning foliage, and warm air drifted through the open doors of the workshop each morning. The scent of fresh-cut wood mingled with the damp earth and new grass, a reminder that renewal does not erase what came before, it grows from it. Work resumed with a steadiness that felt earned rather than assumed. The boutique hotel that had paused its order reinstated the contract after reviewing photographs of the completed furnishings and speaking with long-standing clients. New inquiries arrived through referrals, each one reinforcing what I had always believed. Reputation is built slowly and defended through consistency. Nothing we had preserved was fashionable, yet everything we built was trusted. Daniel moved through the workshop with quiet confidence. He met clients at the front desk, discussing wood selection and finishes with practical clarity, then stepped onto the floor to assist with sanding or assembly when needed. He deferred easily to the craftsmen whose experience exceeded his own, and in doing so, earned their respect. He no longer spoke of ownership, he spoke of responsibility. During the Asheville Spring Craft Festival, we displayed several signature pieces beneath a white tent along the main street. Visitors ran their hands across tabletops and asked about the origin of the designs. I stood slightly behind as Daniel explained how his grandfather had built the first dining tables by hand and how the workshop continued to shape each piece from locally sourced hardwood. He spoke without performance, and I realized the story had become his to carry. That afternoon, he handed me a wrapped bundle. Inside lay the carving tools, restored with careful precision. The fractured handle had been repaired, the seam visible but stabilized, a quiet line marking where the wood had once given way. He told me he was not ready to inherit them fully, that he wished to earn the right through years rather than claim it through blood. I ran my thumb along the repaired grain and understood that restoration does not erase damage. It honors survival. News of Vanessa reached me through a mutual acquaintance. She had begun a modest podcast about rebuilding life honestly after losing the identity she once performed. The audience was smaller, but the conversations were genuine. I felt no bitterness when I heard it, only the recognition that hardship can redirect a life toward truth. That evening, I sat on the porch as twilight gathered over the valley. Windows stood open behind me, and the house felt lived in again, not curated but inhabited. The repaired tools rested beside my chair, carrying both fracture and continuity. I thought about dignity, about boundaries drawn not in anger but in clarity, and about the courage required to protect what cannot be replaced. The mountains remained as they had always been, patient and enduring. I had not returned to who I was before, yet I felt aligned in a way I had never known. Peace, I realized, is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of a life shaped by values one refuses to surrender. Sometimes the hardest lessons arrive quietly, carried in the spaces where expectations fall away and truth is forced to stand on its own. What endures is rarely what dazzles. It is what is built with care, protected with courage, and honored with integrity. Boundaries are not walls against love, but safeguards for dignity. And when they are drawn with clarity, they make room for honesty to return. Loss can strip away illusion, yet it can also reveal the steady ground beneath our feet. In the end, real wealth is measured not by what we gain, but by what we refuse to surrender: self-respect, purpose, and the values that outlast passing approval. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are listening from. Your voice matters. Follow and subscribe for more stories that remind us we are not alone rebuilding and beginning.